There is a version of World War I that most people know. It involves mud and poetry and men going over the top. It involves Wilfred Owen and poppies and a war that ended all wars. It involves courage, sacrifice, and the tragic waste of a generation. That version is real in its way. But it is also a frame built to contain something far more disturbing. It is a story shaped by governments, military institutions, and the collective need to find meaning in a catastrophe so vast and so mechanical that meaning kept dissolving the closer you looked. What actually happened between 1914 and 1918 was something that industrial civilization had never produced before and has never fully reckoned with since. It was not a war in any traditional sense. It was a system, and the most disturbing thing about that system was not how it broke down. It was how well it worked. The first thing that became normal was the scale. When Britain declared war on Germany in August 1914, the British Expeditionary Force numbered around 100,000 men. That felt enormous at the time. By the end of the war, Britain alone had mobilized over 5 million soldiers. France mobilized nearly 8 million. Germany mobilized over 13 million men across the course of the war. The numbers are so large that the mind stops processing them as human beings and begins treating them as statistics. That transition from person to statistic was not an accident. It was a requirement. Armies of that size cannot be administered through personal recognition. They require classification systems, serial numbers, unit designations, medical categories, casualty codes. A man who enters an army at that scale enters a bureaucracy, and bureaucracies process inputs. By 1916, the processing of human beings had become so routine, so thoroughly systematized, that the machinery barely paused when the inputs stopped returning. The medical classification system alone reveals how completely human beings had been converted into administrative categories. Men were assigned fitness grades ranging from fully capable of frontline service down through categories of diminishing capacity to a final designation that meant unfit for any military purpose whatsoever. What those lower categories actually described was often devastating. Permanent hearing loss from artillery, chronic lung damage from gas, neurological damage that could not be named but could be measured in tremors and sleep disruption, and the inability to function in ordinary environments. These men were reclassified, reassigned, sometimes discharged. The paperwork moved, the man moved with it. Whether the man inside the paperwork was the same man who had enlisted 3 years earlier was not a category the system had room to address. The trenches themselves require description that most accounts avoid because the reality is almost impossible to hold in the mind for long. The Western Front at its peak extended approximately 760 miles from the English Channel to the Swiss border. Along most of that distance, opposing armies had dug parallel systems of trenches separated by a stretch of ground called no man's land that ranged anywhere from a few dozen yards to several hundred yards wide. The trenches were not temporary. They became permanent features of the landscape, reinforced with timber, sandbags, corrugated iron, and the bodies of men who had died in them and could not be retrieved. The smell of the front was noted in hundreds of accounts and described in almost identical terms by men who had never met each other. It was a combination of mud, rotting flesh, human waste, gun smoke, and the particular chemical smell of the gases used in the sector. After weeks, men stopped noticing it. After months, they could not detect it at all. Their nervous systems had simply reclassified it as the baseline condition of existence. Rats were present in numbers that are difficult to comprehend. They fed on the dead, which meant they grew large. Contemporary accounts described them as the size of cats. They were bold enough to move through occupied trenches during daylight. They were bold enough to approach sleeping men. Soldiers killed them constantly and without particular emotion because killing them was simply part of the routine. Lice were universal. Every man in the trenches had lice. The lice lived in clothing, in hair, in the seams of uniforms, and could not be removed permanently by any means available. They caused constant itching and were vectors for a disease called trench fever that produced high temperatures, severe pain in the shins, and incapacitation for weeks at a time. Medical officers recorded trench fever cases by the tens of thousands. The lice were noted in diaries not with horror, but with weary familiarity, the way one notes persistent rain. Trench foot was another condition that became routine. It resulted from prolonged exposure to cold, wet conditions, which was the permanent state of the trenches in autumn and winter. The feet, unable to dry, began to decay while still attached to the body. The tissue broke down. In advanced cases, the foot turned black and required amputation. In the early years of the war, trench foot was treated as a personal failure of hygiene, and officers were sometimes held responsible for high rates of the condition in their units. This was not a moral position, it was an administrative one. Trench foot reduced combat effectiveness. Men with blackened feet could not walk. Men who could not walk could not take objectives. Therefore, trench foot was a problem to be managed, not a consequence of keeping human beings standing in freezing water for months at a time. The distinction between cause and symptom was one the system consistently refused to make. The artillery bombardment has become the central sound of the war in retrospect, and it deserves more attention than it typically receives because the scale of it was genuinely unprecedented in human history. Before the Battle of the Somme in July 1916, British artillery fired approximately 1.5 million shells over the course of 7 days. The intention was to destroy the German wire, collapse the German dugouts, and kill or incapacitate the German defenders so completely that British infantry could walk across no man's land and occupy the positions. The bombardment did not achieve most of these objectives. The wire was largely intact. The German defenders had gone deep underground. When the barrage lifted on the morning of July 1st, the German machine gunners came back up and began firing into the advancing British infantry. By the end of that single day, the British Army had suffered approximately 57,000 casualties, of which nearly 20,000 were killed. 57,000 casualties in one day. The number was so large that the commanders initially could not process the reports. The reports came in all day, and the number kept climbing, and the men kept being fed into the line because the attack could not simply stop. Stopping required an order. Orders required assessments. Assessments took time. And while assessments were being made, men continued to advance, and machine guns continued to fire, and the casualty figures continued to rise. The Battle of the Somme lasted until November 1916. By its end, the British had suffered over 400,000 casualties. The French had suffered over 200,000. The Germans had suffered somewhere between 400 and 600,000, depending on the source and the counting method. The line had moved several miles. In some sectors, it had moved less than 1 mile. The mathematics of the exchange rate, which is what military planners called the ratio of casualties inflicted to ground gained, was a calculation that required a particular kind of mind to make without stopping. It required a mind that had successfully completed the conversion from person to unit of military capacity and had made that conversion so thoroughly that the unit cost of an objective could be discussed in the same tone one might use to discuss the unit cost of artillery shells. The men who made those calculations were not monsters. They were administrators. They had been trained to see the war in those terms, and the war had selected for that kind of seeing. The men who could not see that way had been removed earlier. The mechanics of a major offensive in this war had their own internal logic that is important to understand because it explains why the same attacks, producing the same results, were repeated so many times. An offensive required weeks of preparation. Artillery had to be moved forward, ammunition stockpiled, communication trenches deepened, casualty clearing stations positioned, ambulance routes mapped, supply lines established. All of this preparation was visible to the enemy through aerial reconnaissance, which had become a significant intelligence capability by 1916. The enemy knew the offensive was coming. They had time to reinforce their positions, deepen their dugouts, bring up reserves. The attack that arrived was therefore attacking prepared positions. The attackers knew this. The defenders knew the attackers knew this. Both sides knew the attack would likely fail in the first hours. The attack happened anyway, because the logic of the system required it. An offensive that was planned and prepared, and then called off, represented a failure of command, a waste of resources, a loss of initiative. An offensive that was executed and failed was a learning experience. The next offensive would be adjusted. The adjustments would be made. The next offensive would also fail, usually for reasons the adjustments had not anticipated. The use of poison gas introduced a category of suffering that even the war's considerable medical infrastructure was not prepared for. Germany first used chlorine gas on a large scale at Ypres in April 1915. The British and French troops in the line had no protection. The gas moved across no man's land in a visible yellow-green cloud and descended into the trenches. Men who breathed it experienced immediate burning in the throat and lungs. In sufficient concentrations, it destroyed lung tissue, and men drowned in the fluid their own bodies produced in response to the irritant. The initial reaction was described by survivors in terms that make clear the gas attack was almost completely disorienting. There was no frame of reference for it. It looked like something, it smelled like something, and then men were dying in a way that had no name. The military response to the gas was immediate and practical. Primitive masks were issued. Instructions were circulated. Urine-soaked cloths were recommended as emergency protection. All of this was improvisation. The improvisation worked well enough that the line held. The gas had not broken through. The attack had failed. The gas was noted as a weapon to be studied, replicated, and improved. By 1917, both sides were using dozens of different chemical agents. The most feared was mustard gas, introduced by Germany in 1917. Mustard gas was not designed to kill quickly. It was designed to incapacitate. It settled on surfaces, clothing, skin, and caused blistering that could take hours to appear. Men who walked through a mustard gas area often did not realize they had been exposed until hours later, when the blisters began to form on their skin, in their eyes, in their throats. The blisters were severe. Men went temporarily or permanently blind. The genitals were particularly susceptible to mustard gas burns, and the casualty records are full of notations that require no elaboration. Men who survived mustard gas exposure often spent weeks in casualty clearing stations where the standard treatment was to cut away blistered skin and apply bandages that had to be changed regularly, each change being an event that required sedation or simple endurance. The men who had been gassed were noted in the records as chemical casualties, a category that existed alongside the more familiar categories of wounded, killed, and missing. Chemical casualties were a type of administrative input that the system had developed processing procedures for. The procedures were followed. The men were processed. The psychological damage of the war presents its own history of institutional denial that lasted for years after the fighting ended. The condition that would eventually be called shell shock was present from the earliest months of the war. It presented in a variety of forms. Some men developed tremors that would not stop. Some men lost the ability to speak. Some men developed paralysis with no physical injury. Some men simply ceased to function in any recognizable way. They sat. They stared. They did not respond to normal stimuli. Some of them laughed at nothing. Some of them wept continuously. The military response to this in the early years of the war was broadly to deny that it was a real condition. The prevailing view was that these men had weak nerves, had failed morally, had chosen a path of evasion. Some of them were court-martialed for cowardice. Some of them were shot. The British Army executed 306 of its own soldiers during the war. Many of these executions were for offenses like desertion or cowardice in the face of the enemy. The trial procedures were brief. Legal representation was minimal. The standard of evidence required for a conviction was not high. A soldier who had gone missing from his position regardless of the circumstances of that absence could be charged, tried, convicted, and shot within days. The medical evidence available at the time, had anyone been authorized to gather and present it, would have demonstrated that many of these men were suffering from psychological conditions that made rational decision-making impossible. That evidence was not systematically presented. It was not the kind of evidence the court procedures were designed to receive. The executions were carried out by firing squads composed of the condemned men's own comrades, who were sometimes selected and sometimes volunteered. The bodies were buried. The records noted the cause of death and the offense for which the sentence had been carried out. The records were filed. The war continued. The treatment of shell shock evolved over the course of the war in ways that reveal the system's priorities with uncomfortable clarity. By 1917, the volume of psychological casualties had become a significant operational problem. Men who were suffering psychological breakdowns could not fight. Losing them to breakdown reduced the available manpower. The question the system asked was not how these men had been broken, but how they could be returned to service. Treatment programs were developed with that objective. Doctors who believed that rest and removal from the front were the appropriate treatment were overruled or reassigned. The dominant approach was to keep men as close to the front as possible, on the grounds that distance from the front reinforced the idea that breakdown was a ticket out of danger. Proximity treatment, as it came to be called, meant that men in psychological crisis were treated within earshot of the artillery that had contributed to their crisis. The theory was that they would recover faster. Some of them did recover, in the narrow sense that they could be returned to duty. What they had recovered to was not their pre-war psychological state. That state was gone. What they had recovered to was a functioning level of suppression that allowed them to perform soldier tasks. Whether that constituted recovery was a question the system did not stop to ask. The logistics of a modern industrial war were staggering in their complexity and revealing in their priorities. The British Army consumed approximately 5,000 tons of supplies per day on the Western Front at the height of the war. This included food, ammunition, medical supplies, building materials, spare parts for vehicles and artillery, fodder for the hundreds of thousands of horses still being used for transport, and the enormous quantities of wire, timber, and sandbags needed to maintain the physical structure of the trenches. The supply system that delivered this material was run with considerable efficiency. Trains, lorries, horse-drawn wagons, and human-carrying parties moved supplies forward continuously. The system was sophisticated enough to track consumption rates and project future requirements. It was capable of anticipating a shortage of a particular type of artillery shell and diverting production resources to address that shortage. The same system that tracked shell consumption also tracked manpower consumption. Replacement drafts were calculated based on projected casualty rates. If a division was expected to lose a certain percentage of its strength in a forthcoming operation, replacement personnel were allocated in advance. The calculation was routine. The language in which it was made was indistinguishable from the language used for any other supply problem. The horses deserve a separate accounting. The British Army alone used approximately 1 million horses during the war. These animals transported artillery, supplies, and wounded men. They were used in cavalry operations that became steadily more rare as the war progressed, and terrain made mounted action impractical. They died in enormous numbers. They were killed by artillery, by gas, and by the conditions of the front, which were as unsurvivable for horses as they were for men. The veterinary services that cared for sick and injured horses were extensive. Horses that could be saved were saved and returned to service. Horses too badly injured to save were destroyed. The scale of this operation was large enough to require dedicated veterinary hospitals, supply chains for medical equipment, and administrative records. The men who worked with horses often formed attachments to particular animals that the administrative record does not capture because attachment was not a category the record had room for. When a horse an artilleryman had worked with for 2 years was killed, the death was recorded as an equipment loss. The artilleryman continued functioning. That was the requirement. The management of the dead was an industry in itself. The scale of killing made improvised burial impossible within months of the war's beginning. Dedicated graves registration units were formed to locate, identify, mark, and record the dead. The work was performed continuously. Men who had died in no man's land and could not be retrieved were noted as missing. Their families received telegrams informing them that the soldier was missing, which was a category designed to leave the possibility of survival open for administrative and psychological reasons. Many of these men were not missing. They were in pieces in no man's land, or they had been buried by artillery fire, or they had been in a direct artillery hit, and there was nothing to bury. The category of missing was a humane fiction, but it was also a practical one, because the machinery of casualty notification was running at such speed that precision was not always achievable. By the end of the war, there were over 300,000 British and Commonwealth soldiers whose bodies had never been found or identified. The official category for these men was known only to God, a phrase that appears on thousands of headstones in the war cemeteries of France and Belgium. It is a phrase that acknowledges the limits of the administrative record while maintaining the form of a record. The food that soldiers ate at the front was another normalization that happened gradually and completely. British rations were calculated to provide sufficient calories for physical activity. They were not calculated to provide enjoyment, variety, or anything that could be described as a relationship with food. The staples were bully beef, which was canned corned beef of varying quality, hardtack biscuits that were sometimes so hard they had to be broken with a rifle butt, and tea. When fresh bread arrived, it was considered a significant event. Fresh vegetables were rare enough that their appearance was noted in letters home. Men ate what was available because hunger was the alternative, and hunger was not something the system had allocated space for. They cooked over small fires when fires were permitted, which was not always. They ate cold food in the trenches because fires created smoke that drew artillery fire. They ate when they could, where they could, in conditions that civilian food inspectors would have condemned immediately. The digestive problems that resulted were universal and are documented throughout the medical records in terms that make clear the army was aware of the problem and had determined that the operational situation made addressing it impossible. The rotation system that was supposed to move men periodically out of the front line was real, and it was important, and it was also insufficient in ways the men who experienced it understood very well. The idea was that units would spend time in the front-line trenches, then rotate to support positions, then rotate further back to reserve positions, and occasionally receive a period of rest well behind the front. In practice, the distances involved were small. Rest billets were often within range of long-range artillery. The sound of the guns was continuous regardless of distance. During major operations, the rotation system was suspended entirely because there were no units available to rotate in. During the Battle of Passchendaele in 1917, some units spent months in the line with minimal rotation because the operational situation required continuous presence. The mud at Passchendaele was a particular kind of hell that even the standardized language of official reports struggled to contain. The ground had been so thoroughly churned by 4 years of artillery fire that it had lost structural integrity. Men who stepped off the defined paths sank. Men who sank could not always be pulled out. Some of them drowned in mud while other men watched. This was recorded. It was processed. It was filed. The role of women in the war requires inclusion here because the normalization of industrial death extended behind the front lines in ways that are sometimes overlooked. Women in Britain and France and other combatant nations went to work in munitions factories, producing the shells and bullets and components that the front consumed. The conditions in these factories were dangerous. Exposure to the chemicals used in explosive production caused a condition called toxic jaundice, or TNT poisoning, which turned the skin and hair bright yellow, hence the nickname Canary Girls given to munitions workers. In severe cases, TNT poisoning was fatal. It caused liver failure, and it killed women who had never been near the front. The compensation for this occupational death risk was the factory wage, which was higher than the wages available to women in domestic service or retail. The state was aware of the health effects. Medical studies were conducted. The studies were noted. Production continued because the shells were needed and the women were available. This calculation was never stated in those terms in any official document. It was simply the logic of the situation, and the logic was followed. The nurses and medical staff who worked in the casualty clearing stations and base hospitals were processing a continuous flow of human damage at a rate that had no precedent in medical history. A casualty clearing station during a major offensive received hundreds of men per day. The surgical teams operated around the clock. The triage system, which assigns treatment priority based on survivability rather than need, was developed partly in response to the impossibility of treating everyone with equal urgency. Men who were beyond saving were made comfortable, which was a phrase that meant they were given morphine if it was available, and placed where they would not disturb the surgical work. Men who would survive without immediate surgery were also set aside. The resources were directed at the men in between, those who would die without immediate surgery and might survive with it. This calculus was performed continuously by exhausted people in conditions of noise and blood and insufficient supplies. The nurses who performed it were not machines, but they learned to perform machine functions. They had to. The volume required it. The experience of officers versus enlisted men is worth dwelling on because the class dimensions of the war are often minimized in general histories. The British officer corps was drawn almost entirely from the upper and middle classes. Public school education was the standard background. These men led their troops from the front, which meant their casualty rates were in some respects even higher than enlisted rates. But they also ate better, slept in better accommodation when accommodation existed, had access to better medical care, and were subject to a different disciplinary regime. An officer who showed signs of psychological breakdown was more likely to be diagnosed with neurasthenia, a respectable-sounding medical condition, and sent to a hospital in England. An enlisted man displaying the same symptoms was more likely to be suspected of malingering and returned to duty. The class distinction in psychological treatment was documented by the doctors who administered it, some of whom found it troubling, but the social structures that produced it were the same structures that ran the army, and changing them was not within anyone's individual authority. The censorship of soldiers' letters was systematic and thorough. Every letter that passed through the army postal system was subject to examination by an officer, and anything that could provide information to the enemy or damage civilian morale was removed, or the entire letter was destroyed. Soldiers knew their letters were read. They developed codes, oblique references, ways of communicating reality through language that appeared innocuous. The censors were sophisticated enough to look for this, and sometimes found it. The letters that reached families at home were therefore not the complete record of what the men were experiencing. They were the portion of that experience that had passed through a filter designed to preserve a particular version of the war. The families who read these letters received love and small details, and occasionally dark humor, and almost never the full weight of what was happening. This was intended. It was policy. The version of the war that civilians understood was the version the military and government had determined they should understand. And the management of that version was considered a legitimate military objective. The introduction of the tank in 1916 is typically presented as a turning point in military technology, which in the long run it was. In the immediate context of the war, however, it is more accurately understood as an improvised response to a tactical problem that had resisted all previous solutions. The tank was a mechanical device designed to cross trenches and barbed wire, suppress machine gun fire, and allow infantry to advance behind mobile armor. The first tanks used at the Somme in September 1916 broke down frequently, moved at walking pace, were mechanically unreliable, and terrified their crews as much as they surprised the German defenders. The crews inside them were subjected to heat, fumes, deafening noise, and extreme physical disorientation. Tanks in motion were nearly impossible to direct with precision. Communication between tank and infantry was minimal. The tactical coordination required to use tanks effectively did not exist in 1916 because no doctrine for it had been developed, because tanks had not existed before 1916, and doctrine follows hardware rather than preceding it. The men who crewed the early tanks were volunteers who had been told little about what they were volunteering for. They volunteered because they were asked, and because the alternative was the infantry, and the infantry had become a thing men were willing to do almost anything to avoid. Aviation underwent a transformation during the war that was equally rapid and equally driven by the logic of attrition. At the beginning of the war, aircraft were used primarily for observation, locating enemy positions and directing artillery fire. They were not armed. When opposing observation aircraft encountered each other, the pilots sometimes waved. This situation lasted approximately until the point when someone realized that the opposing observer was reporting artillery adjustments that were killing people, at which point the pilots began bringing rifles and pistols into the air with them, and then throwing grenades, and then mounting machine guns on improvised mounts, and then developing synchronized firing mechanisms that allowed machine guns to fire through the propeller arc. The development of fighter aviation was therefore driven not by strategic vision, but by the immediate tactical problem of preventing enemy observers from doing their work. The air war that resulted was the first air war in human history, conducted by men who were learning to fight in 3 dimensions with machines that had existed for less than 15 years, at altitudes and speeds that had no precedent. The casualty rates among fighter pilots were extraordinary. During some periods of the war, the average life expectancy of a new pilot on the Western Front was measured in weeks. This was known. The training programs that produced replacement pilots were aware of this figure because the replacement rate required to maintain operational strength was a planning input. The pilots were trained in the minimum time necessary to produce a functioning aviator. Some of them arrived at the front unable to perform basic maneuvers. Some of them were killed within days of their arrival. The losses were recorded and processed, and new pilots were requested from the training establishments, and the training establishments produced them and sent them forward. The role of religion in the war deserves examination because it illustrates something important about how institutions function under extreme stress. Military chaplains were present in enormous numbers, serving men of various denominations, conducting services, visiting the wounded, writing letters to families of the dead, administering last rites to the dying. The chaplains were genuine in their faith and genuine in their care for the men they served. They were also representatives of institutions that had largely endorsed the war, that had in many cases actively encouraged men to enlist, that had applied religious language to the act of killing enemies in ways that the actual combatants often found unconvincing. The men at the front developed their own relationship with religion that bore limited resemblance to the formal practice the chaplains represented. Some men became more devout under the pressure of continuous proximity to death. Many more developed a fatalism that incorporated religious language into a framework that was not exactly faith and not exactly its absence. The chaplains who were most respected by the men were typically those who stayed close to the front, who did not deliver sermons about sacrifice and duty from safe positions, who simply sat with men who were afraid and made themselves available. What those chaplains believed privately about the justice or meaning of the war is rarely recorded, because expressing such opinions was not permitted, and most of them were too exhausted to write anything beyond the essential letters and records. The management of propaganda was another system that ran in parallel with the military system and was thoroughly integrated with it. The British War Propaganda Bureau, established in the first weeks of the war, produced posters, pamphlets, books, films, and newspaper stories designed to maintain civilian support for the war and encourage enlistment. The propaganda was sophisticated for its time and drew on the talents of writers, artists, and academics who were genuine patriots and genuine believers in the justice of the Allied cause. Some of what the propaganda said was true. Germany had invaded Belgium. The German military had committed atrocities against civilians, some of which were real, some of which were embellished, and a few of which were invented. The propaganda system could not always distinguish between these categories, partly because the intelligence on which it drew was uncertain, and partly because the system's purpose was persuasion rather than accuracy. And those are different projects. As the war continued and the casualty lists grew, the propaganda had to work harder to maintain the frame that sustained civilian willingness to continue sending sons and husbands to the front. The language of sacrifice was deployed continuously. The dead were heroes, the wounded were brave, the missing had given everything. These were not lies in the technical sense, because they were applied to events that had actually occurred and to men who had actually died. But they were a translation of reality into a language designed for a purpose, and the purpose shaped the translation in ways that made it progressively less accurate. The experience of soldiers returning home on leave, and later returning home for good, reveals the fracture between the two realities that the war had created. Men on leave from the front arrived in a world that was talking about the war constantly, but did not know what the war was. The newspapers were full of the war. The conversations at home were full of the war, but the war in those conversations bore limited resemblance to what the men had left behind. There was no way to explain the smell, the lice, the sight of a man's head removed by a shell fragment, the sound of men dying slowly in no man's land because it was not safe to retrieve them, the administrative routine of recording the deaths of people you had known and found them to be exactly as routine as any other administrative task. There was no language for it that the home world understood. The men who tried to explain were met with incomprehension and sometimes with responses that reflected the propaganda version of the war, which was the only version the home world had access to. After one or two attempts, most men stopped trying. They sat in family parlors, surrounded by people who loved them, and felt an isolation that they could not describe, because describing it required the other person to have been there, and the other person had not been there. And the point of the whole enterprise was that the other person would not have to be there. The relationship between the armies of opposing nations, which is rarely addressed in official histories because it complicates the enemy image the propaganda system required, was more complex and more human than the official account allows. Soldiers on both sides of the line shared the same mud, the same cold, the same lice, the same terror, the same exhaustion. The live and let live system, which developed spontaneously in sectors where neither side had orders to conduct active operations, was an informal agreement to reduce mutual casualties by avoiding aggressive action. Both sides would fire at predictable times and in predictable directions, creating a kind of negative space in which men could move without being shot. Officers on both sides were ordered to disrupt these arrangements because quiet sectors were considered militarily unacceptable. The disruption was achieved by ordering trench raids, which were small-scale nighttime attacks on the enemy's trenches designed to kill or capture personnel and demonstrate aggressive spirit. The men ordered to conduct these raids often found them deeply pointless because they understood exactly what the raids were disrupting, and what they were disrupting seemed to them more rational than what was replacing it. This opinion was not one they could express to their officers. It was expressed in letters, in diaries and in conversations among themselves, and it was filtered out of the official record almost completely. The treatment of prisoners of war constituted another system running alongside the others. Both sides took prisoners, and the legal framework for their treatment had been established by the Geneva and Hague Conventions. In general, prisoners behind the lines were treated in accordance with the conventions, which is to say they were held in camps, given food and medical attention, and not systematically killed. The experience of capture itself was more dangerous, because men who surrendered in the immediate vicinity of combat were sometimes killed before they could be effectively taken prisoner. This occurred on both sides. It was a reality of the tactical situation that men who had been trying to kill each other moments before were now expected to treat each other according to international law, and the transition was not always made cleanly. The men who killed prisoners rather than taking them were sometimes disciplined and sometimes not, depending on the circumstances and the command culture of the unit. The official position was that prisoners were to be treated according to convention. The operational reality was that the official position was a starting point from which individual units and individual soldiers made their own calculations, and those calculations were influenced by exhaustion and anger and the proximity of friends who had been recently killed, factors that the official position had not designed itself to address. The use of colonial troops deserves particular attention because it illuminates the hierarchy of human expendability that the war made explicit. Britain drew troops from across its empire, including India, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, South Africa, the Caribbean, and various parts of Africa. France drew troops from West Africa, North Africa, Madagascar, and Indochina. The contribution of these troops to the Allied effort was militarily significant. The Anzac forces, the Canadian Corps, the Indian Army divisions, and the African troops of the French Army all served with distinction in the most dangerous conditions of the war. Their casualty rates were comparable to or exceeded those of metropolitan troops. Their treatment in terms of pay, equipment, and medical care was in many cases inferior. Their representation in the propaganda materials that celebrated Allied military achievement was selective at best and absent at worst. The Indian soldiers who died at Gallipoli, the West African soldiers who died in the Dardanelles campaign, the Caribbean soldiers who were initially refused combat roles entirely and assigned to labor battalions, all of these men entered the system that the war had built, and the system processed them according to their assigned category, and their assigned category reflected the racial and imperial hierarchies of the societies that had built the system. This is not a judgment. It is a description of how the system functioned. The blockade that Britain maintained against Germany for the duration of the war is rarely discussed in the same context as the trench warfare, but it deserves inclusion here because it represents another form of organized mass death that the war normalized. The naval blockade prevented food and raw materials from reaching Germany by sea. Its effects accumulated over years. By 1916 and 1917, Germany was experiencing severe food shortages. Civilian rations were reduced repeatedly. The turnip winter of 1916 to 1917 saw the German civilian population subsisting on a diet centered on turnips because virtually everything else was unavailable. The death toll among German civilians from malnutrition and related diseases during the war and immediately after is estimated at over 400,000 people. These were not combatants. They were old men, women, and children who died from the cumulative effects of economic warfare. The blockade was a legitimate instrument of war under the international law of the time. It was planned, maintained, and systematically enforced by naval officers following orders within a legal framework. The deaths it produced were not accidents. They were anticipated effects of a deliberate strategy. They were processed as strategic outcomes. The period immediately following the armistice of November 11, 1918, reveals something important about what the war had actually been. The guns stopped at 11 in the morning. Men who had been living in the conditions described above found themselves in a silence that many accounts describe as more disturbing than the noise. The machinery had stopped, and there was nothing to fill the space it had occupied. The demobilization process began immediately and was enormous in its scope, returning millions of men to civilian life over the course of months. The process was managed with the same administrative efficiency that had managed everything else, and with the same indifference to the individual that administrative efficiency tends to produce. Men were classified, processed, paid off, handed civilian clothing, and released. There were no counseling services in any modern sense. There was no recognition that returning men might require something more than documentation. The assumption embedded in the demobilization process was that soldiers would return to civilian life and resume their previous roles, that the break was manageable and the return was straightforward. The reality was different. The suicide rate among veterans in the years following the war was elevated. The alcoholism rate was elevated. The rates of what we would now call post-traumatic stress disorder were elevated, but the condition had no name and no established treatment pathway, so the men who had it were, in administrative terms, either functioning or not functioning. Those who were not functioning became the concern of the medical system if their dysfunction was severe enough to require hospitalization, or became the concern of their families if it was not. The families had received these men back into their homes without any preparation for who they were now, because the system had not developed procedures for that preparation, and because the propaganda frame that had sustained the civilian understanding of the war had never included the possibility that the men who returned might be something other than heroic and intact. The gap between expectation and reality was another thing for which there were no forms and no filing procedures. The war memorials that began to appear in towns and villages across Britain and France and Germany and everywhere else the war had reached were sincere expressions of grief. They were also structures designed to perform a particular function, which was to contain grief within a form that the community could sustain without destroying itself. The function required a particular kind of language, and the language of the memorials is remarkably consistent across different nations and different communities. The dead are honored. Their sacrifice is acknowledged. They are remembered. What the memorials do not say, because the form of a memorial cannot say it, is what actually happened to the bodies they are commemorating, or what those bodies went through before they arrived at the state of commemoration. The gap between the form and the reality is not a criticism of the memorials. It is a description of what memorials are for. They are administrative records of a kind. But the category they record is loss, and the bureaucracy that processes loss has always found it necessary to translate raw experience into forms that can be tolerated, because raw experience in sufficient volume is exactly what the system was designed to prevent from reaching the surface. The influenza pandemic that swept the world in 1918 and 1919 and killed somewhere between 50 and 100 million people globally began in the conditions the war had created. The mass movement of troops, the crowded camps and ships and hospitals, the malnutrition of civilian populations, the collapse of public health infrastructure in combatant nations, all of these conditions created a biological situation in which a particularly virulent strain of influenza could spread with unprecedented speed. The pandemic killed more people than the war itself. In some countries, the two death tolls were roughly comparable. The military medical systems that had been managing war casualties were now also managing pandemic casualties, and in many cases the distinction between the two was not clear, because sick soldiers were dying in casualty clearing stations alongside wounded soldiers. The pandemic was processed. It was classified. It was added to the casualty counts as a category of medical loss. The war was officially over. The dying continued for another year. The peace treaties that ended the war created conditions that the participants at the time already understood would create future instability. The German reparations demanded by the Treaty of Versailles were widely recognized, including by some of the Allied negotiators, as economically unsustainable. The redrawing of national boundaries created new minorities and new resentments across Central and Eastern Europe. The dissolution of the Austro-Hungarian and Ottoman empires created power vacuums that were filled partly by new nation-states and partly by new conflicts. The mandate system that distributed the territories of the Ottoman Empire among Britain and France created colonial arrangements that the populations concerned had not requested and did not accept. All of this was known. The knowledge was processed and documented and included in the negotiating records. The treaties were signed anyway because the alternative was continued negotiation, and the domestic political pressures in all the victorious nations required a conclusion, and a conclusion that acknowledged its own instability was better than no conclusion at all. The logic was followed to its end. The conclusion was reached. The conclusion was unstable in the ways that had been predicted. The next war began within 20 years. What the war had actually produced, beneath all the official accounts and the propaganda and the memorials and the poetry and the political settlements, was a new relationship between human beings and industrial killing. Before 1914, mass death at this scale had not existed in modern experience. It had to be created, which required not just weapons and logistics, but also administrative systems, psychological frameworks, and social arrangements that could normalize the production and processing of mass casualties as a routine function of organized society. Those systems, frameworks, and arrangements were created. They worked. The war was administered from beginning to end with a bureaucratic competence that ensured the killing could continue at the required rate for the required duration. By the time it was over, Every major institution that had participated, governments, militaries, medical systems, industrial systems, communication systems, had been reformed by the experience of administering industrialized death at scale. The knowledge did not disappear when the guns stopped. The people who had acquired it remained. The institutions that had developed it remained. The appetite for the next application of that knowledge had already been created by the resentments and instabilities the first one had left behind. The war ended on November 11th, 1918, and the daily management of its consequences continued for years without a formal administrative structure to contain them, which meant that the consequences moved through ordinary civilian life in the form of damaged men and grieving families and altered institutions and economic disruptions and political extremisms, and none of that had a filing system, and none of it was processed with the efficiency the war itself had achieved, because the war had been organized and the peace was not. And the organization that had made the mass death possible had made the mass death manageable. And the absence of organization made the aftermath something no one had quite planned for, even though several people had predicted it exactly.